I never expected to feel like an outsider in my own marriage. I'd imagined the worst-case scenarios before: awkward family gatherings, overcooked turkey, even a wine spill on a white blouse. But nothing quite like this. Nothing that could make me feel so invisible. When my husband told me his family had invited us to dinner at La Vieille Table, one of the most exclusive restaurants in town, I was genuinely surprised. His parents had never been cold exactly, but there was always a chill in the air when I entered a room. A certain restraint in their smiles, a formality that screamed I wasn't quite one of them. Still, I was hopeful. Maybe this dinner was a peace offering. Maybe after 3 years of marriage, they were finally opening a seat at the table for me, literally and figuratively. I spent the entire afternoon getting ready, not because I was trying to impress them, at least that's what I told myself, but because I wanted to feel prepared, powerful, presentable. I curled my hair, applied a soft mauve lipstick, and wore a deep navy dress that made my eyes look brighter than usual. As I stood in the mirror, I repeated a little mantra: be warm, be gracious, be yourself. My husband picked me up with a rushed kiss on the cheek and a quick compliment about my dress. He seemed distracted, but I chalked it up to nerves. He knew how tense things could get when his family and I were in the same room. The restaurant was only 15 minutes away, but my thoughts stretched the drive into a quiet meditation. I envisioned the evening unfolding smoothly, a toast to togetherness, polite laughter, perhaps even a meaningful glance from his mother that said, "We're glad you're here." I couldn't have been more wrong. When we arrived, the valet took our car and we walked inside to the soft clinking of crystal and murmured conversations. The maitre d' greeted us with a knowing smile and waved toward the back, where a long, beautifully set table shimmered under a chandelier. 7 people sat there: his parents, his sister and her fiancé, 2 cousins, and an older uncle I'd met only once before. But something was off, terribly off. There were only 7 chairs. My husband paused, scanning the table as though something might shift if he stared hard enough. His mother stood, walked toward us with open arms, and gave him a quick hug. "Oh, sweetheart, glad you made it," she said, barely glancing in my direction. Then, as if reading from a bad sitcom script, she added, "We weren't sure if you'd be coming, so we didn't include an extra seat. Hope that's okay." No apology, no attempt to fix it, just a casual dismissal, like forgetting a napkin. My cheeks burned. I looked at my husband, expecting him to say something, to protest, to demand a seat be added, to do anything, but he only offered a weak smile and said, "Maybe they thought you were driving separately." No, they didn't. We both knew that. "Oh, but there's a stool over by the bar," his mother added, gesturing vaguely toward the other side of the room. "You could sit there and still be close." The air around me felt thick. My chest tightened, not from anger, not yet, but from humiliation. I swallowed hard, blinking back the sting behind my eyes. I would not cry, not here, not now. I turned toward the bar, where a lonely stool did, in fact, sit facing away from the table. My feet moved on instinct, but my heart screamed to stop. I froze midway. This wasn't a mistake, it was a message. And in that moment, something shifted in me. Instead of lowering my head and accepting the scraps of their hospitality, I squared my shoulders and walked toward the hostess stand. The young woman blinked in surprise as I approached. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" she asked. "Yes," I said with a calmness I didn't quite feel. "I'd like a table for one, please, somewhere by the window if possible." She nodded quickly, and within moments I was led to a small corner table tucked beside a set of tall glass panes that looked out onto the street below. The linen was crisp. The candle flickered gently. It was perfect in the way an unexpected kindness can be. As I sat down and opened the menu, something else shifted, this time inside me. I wasn't just taking a seat. I was reclaiming a piece of myself I hadn't even realized I'd surrendered. And before we go any further, if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or simply erased from a moment you were supposed to belong to, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Because trust me, this story is just getting started. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the linen napkin and placed it across my lap. Across the room, their laughter drifted faintly, each note a reminder that I wasn't meant to be part of it. I tried not to look their way, but my eyes betrayed me. 7 people, comfortably seated, raising glasses, swapping inside jokes I was never invited into. I watched as my husband leaned toward his sister, clearly trying to decipher something, his brow furrowed. Then he turned his head toward me. For a brief moment our eyes met. He looked confused, maybe even guilty, but he didn't get up. He didn't cross the room. He didn't speak. My mother-in-law, as though sensing his hesitation, reached for his arm and said something that made him glance away. It was the kind of moment that said everything without a single word. He wasn't going to challenge her. Not tonight. The waitress arrived at my table with a soft smile. "Would you like to start with a drink?" "Champagne," I said without thinking. "Actually, make it a bottle." She blinked, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am." I wasn't trying to be dramatic, but I also wasn't going to sit there and pretend this was normal. I didn't want to sip tap water and pretend I hadn't been humiliated. If they could pretend I didn't exist, then I could pretend they didn't either. Behind me, I could still hear them. Not their words, just the rhythm of their voices. It was like music from another room, familiar but unreachable. A few minutes later, the champagne arrived, icy and elegant. The cork popped like a declaration. I poured myself a glass and raised it silently. To dignity, to boundaries, to not begging for scraps. I took a sip and the bubbles danced across my tongue, crisp and bold. It wasn't about the drink. It was about the message I was sending myself. I don't need to be where I'm not wanted. I looked out the window and let my thoughts drift. How many times had I sat quietly, ignoring the backhanded comments, the subtle digs? I'd tried to play nice. I'd laughed when they laughed, even when the joke was at my expense. I'd helped clean up after their parties, smiled through holiday dinners, bit my tongue more times than I could count. All for what? A stool at the bar? Not anymore. I heard a clink behind me. A waiter dropped a fork. I turned slightly, catching a glimpse of the family table. My husband was speaking, his hands moving subtly. He didn't once look in my direction. No one did. They weren't embarrassed. They weren't even curious. That was the real sting. It wasn't just a mistake, it was their comfort with my absence. Their ease in pretending I was never supposed to be there. The waitress returned with a menu, laying it gently before me. "Would you like a recommendation?" "Something rich," I said, closing it again. "Surprise me." She smiled again and walked off, and for a second I felt something like relief. Like maybe this dinner wasn't a tragedy. Maybe it was liberation. I didn't feel angry, at least not in the way I expected. It was something quieter, heavier, disappointment laced with clarity. And clarity, no matter how painful, has a strange kind of peace attached to it. I looked down at the bubbles in my glass. They rose quickly, chaotically, bursting on the surface. I traced one with my finger along the stem of the flute. I realized I'd been holding in so much for so long, waiting for their approval like it was a prize I had to earn. But what if I didn't need it? What if I stopped trying? What if being excluded wasn't the worst thing, but the best? Across the room, the table burst into laughter again. I didn't look. I didn't need to. I raised my glass once more, not in bitterness, but in quiet strength. And I whispered to myself, let them laugh. Because the truth was, I wasn't the one who should be embarrassed. I wasn't the one who had failed to make room. They had. And in that silence, my stillness, I found something they couldn't take from me. Self-respect. The waitress reappeared with a dish that smelled of garlic and butter and everything decadent. She placed it before me like a gift, and I thanked her with the kind of smile I hadn't used in a while, one that came from somewhere real. I picked up my fork, ready to eat, ready to stay, ready to enjoy my own company. And as I took that first bite, rich and perfect, I realized I'd done something that terrified them more than confrontation. I'd chosen myself. The first bite was perfect, silky pasta swirled in garlic cream, topped with herbs that burst on my tongue. I chewed slowly, letting the flavors settle, letting the moment breathe. It felt strange to enjoy something so deeply on an evening that had started with rejection, But there I was, a woman alone at a table for one, surrounded by opulence, holding a glass of champagne and savoring every second. Across the room, the muted tones of their conversation continued. I could still sense them, still feel the warmth of the chandelier above their table, still hear the clink of forks on porcelain, but they no longer mattered. I had detached myself, not out of spite, but out of necessity. As I ate, the servers treated me with gentle attentiveness. No judgment, no questions, just respect. A woman dining alone isn't such a novelty in a city like this, but I knew they could read something deeper in my posture, in the way I held my glass, in the steadiness of my hands. This wasn't about being alone, this was about reclaiming space. The second course arrived, grilled fish with lemon caper sauce, delicately plated beside roasted fennel and sweet potatoes. I closed my eyes as I tasted it. The tanginess brightened the richness of the first dish. It was bold and balanced, everything I hadn't felt at that table across the room. Then I noticed him. He was standing near the bar, tall and composed, with a presence that filled the space without trying. He wore a navy suit that was tailored perfectly, not flashy but timeless. His hair was neatly combed, silver at the temples, and his expression was thoughtful. He wasn't watching me in the way men often watch women alone. There was no leer, no smirk, just curiosity. For a while, I ignored him, unsure whether I should acknowledge his gaze. But as I reached for my champagne, I saw him take a few steps closer, still not intrusive, just intentional. "Is everything to your liking?" he asked, his voice calm, with an accent I couldn't quite place. "Yes," I replied. "More than I expected, actually." He nodded once, slowly. "Good. I noticed you earlier. You carry yourself like someone who's used to being somewhere else." The comment caught me off guard, not because it was rude, but because it was startlingly accurate. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I set my glass down and met his eyes. And what does that mean? He gave a slight smile. It means sometimes we don't know we're in the wrong room until someone forgets to save us a chair. That made me laugh, genuinely, the first laugh of the night. "Well," I said, gesturing to the empty seat across from me, "this room turned out better than expected." He tilted his head, considering the invitation, then sat, not presumptuously, gracefully, like someone who knew that presence didn't have to shout. "I'm Marcello," he said. "I own this place." I blinked. "Really?" He shrugged. "I try to stay behind the scenes. But sometimes the front of the house tells better stories." I smiled. "Well, you have excellent taste. The food is phenomenal." "I'm glad you think so. We make everything fresh daily, from the pasta to the bread." We sat like that for a few moments, two strangers, separated by nothing more than unfamiliarity and drawn together by timing. Marcello didn't ask for explanations. He didn't prod or press. He spoke about the wine selection, the art on the walls, and the small herb garden he kept on the rooftop terrace. His voice was warm, but never overbearing. He had the ease of someone who listened more than he talked. When the waitress came by again, he ordered oysters for the table. "On the house," he insisted, and when she returned, I noticed he poured me another glass before pouring one for himself. I should have felt awkward, but I didn't. I felt seen. The oysters were delicate and fresh, resting on a bed of ice with lemon wedges and a small bowl of mignonette sauce. We clinked glasses once more, and he said, "To making the most of unexpected evenings." "To not begging for a seat," I added. He raised a brow. "I like that even more." And as I tasted the oyster, salty, smooth, perfect, I realized I wasn't just enjoying a meal. I was experiencing the kind of night that sticks with you forever, not because it was planned, but because it shattered expectations. The laughter from the other table had faded into background noise. It was still there, but no longer sharp, no longer relevant. I was no longer waiting for them to notice me. I had already moved on. Marcello had the kind of presence that made time slow down, not dramatically, not like in the movies, but in that subtle way where your breathing evens out and your shoulders drop without realizing. Sitting across from him, I forgot for a moment that this evening had begun as a disaster. His voice, smooth but grounded, filled the spaces in between the clinks of cutlery and murmurs of the other diners. He told me about the early days of the restaurant, how he came to the States with a single suitcase and a head full of half-broken English, how the first iteration of this place had 6 tables and plastic chairs, how on his worst night, a customer spat out a dish and left without paying. "And yet," I said, gesturing around, "here you are now." He smiled, not prideful, grateful. Failure's just a seasoning. A little bitter, a little sharp, but it wakes you up. I laughed again, not out of politeness, but because something about his view of the world felt honest, unfiltered. It had been a long time since someone spoke to me like that, without performance, without coded language. He didn't ask about the people at the other table, not directly. But at one point, his eyes flicked in their direction and then back to me. I followed his gaze briefly. They were still there, still eating, still pretending I didn't exist. "Old friends?" he asked casually, not unkindly. I took a sip of champagne. Family, in-law variety. He didn't react, no raised brows, no pity in his eyes, just a simple nod, like he understood. I didn't elaborate and he didn't ask me to. That silence between us wasn't awkward, it was respectful. And in that space I found something I hadn't known I needed, the luxury of not having to explain myself. He leaned back, studying me for a second. "You carry yourself like someone who's been biting their tongue for too long." I tilted my head. "Is that your specialty? Reading people who eat alone?" He chuckled. "It's my job to notice what others ignore." For a moment I didn't respond. I just let the words settle. Because that was exactly it. I'd been ignored so thoroughly by people who claimed to love me, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be noticed. The waitress returned with the next course, seared duck breast with a cherry glaze, 2 plates this time. One placed before me, the other before Marcello, as though the decision had been made silently. He didn't ask if he could join me. He simply had, and I didn't mind. Conversation flowed easily. He told stories about chefs he'd trained with in Naples, about a time he'd accidentally set a pan on fire during a private event for a celebrity he wasn't allowed to name. I told him about my love for cooking that had faded after marriage, how my kitchen had become less of a sanctuary and more of a battlefield between preferences and dismissals. "You stopped cooking because of them?" he asked gently. I shrugged. I stopped enjoying it. It became one more thing to do right, one more thing to be judged for. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Judgment is often a mirror, not a window. Their problem, not yours." Those words hit deeper than they should have. Not because I hadn't heard similar sentiments before, but because no one had ever said it like it mattered, like I mattered. I noticed the glances starting then from the other table. My mother-in-law turned her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. My sister-in-law whispered something behind a napkin. Even my husband, who'd barely glanced my way earlier, now seemed to notice that I was enjoying myself. I could feel their disapproval from across the room, wrapped in confusion and discomfort. But I didn't look away. I didn't shrink. Marcello noticed too. He raised his glass again. "To being underestimated," he said. "To rising above it," I replied, and we clinked gently. As we ate, I watched as Marcello gave a brief nod to a passing waiter, an unspoken exchange that said volumes. This was his world, and he moved through it like someone who had earned every inch of ground beneath him. He didn't need to impress me, and that was what made him impressive. The duck was tender, the glaze sweet but complex, and for the first time that evening I wasn't eating to fill space or silence. I was eating because I wanted to be fully present in this moment, because it tasted like something I deserved. "Next time you cook," Marcello said, "do it for yourself, not for anyone else." I smiled. Next time I might. And as we finished our plates, the last notes of tension inside me began to melt, not because the pain had vanished, but because something stronger had started to grow in its place: clarity. By the time dessert menus arrived, the air in the room had shifted. Not for everyone, just for them. I could feel it even without turning around. That subtle discomfort, the kind that prickles along the back of your neck when you know you're being watched. I didn't need to look to know my in-laws had noticed. Marcello's presence at my table had become undeniable. He wasn't loud. He wasn't putting on a show. He was simply there, calm, elegant, and undeniably welcome. From the corner of my eye, I caught the briefest flicker. My mother-in-law's tight jaw, my sister-in-law's not-so-subtle whisper, my husband's glance darting between our table and his untouched glass. Marcello noticed too. He leaned back, amusement in his expression, and murmured, "Quite the audience." "They're not used to seeing me like this," I replied. "How's that?" "Not trying," I said, and took another sip of champagne, "not asking to be allowed in." He nodded, as if he understood far more than I'd said. I reached for a chocolate tart topped with gold flakes. It was rich, smooth, and unapologetically decadent. Everything I'd never let myself enjoy around them. Every bite felt like a rebellion, a quiet one, but powerful nonetheless. For so long I'd trained myself to shrink, to become palatable. I'd softened my voice, softened my opinions, folded myself into someone they could tolerate, even if that version of me felt like a shadow. But sitting across from Marcello, laughing softly, being exactly who I was without apology, I felt like I had stepped out of hiding. "They didn't expect this from you," he said, not as a question. "They expected me to sit at the bar," I answered, "and be grateful for it." He studied me a moment longer. That's the danger of underestimating someone who's been quiet too long. Sooner or later, they stop asking. They start choosing. His words stayed with me as I glanced across the restaurant. My husband had finally turned his full attention to our table. His face was unreadable, somewhere between confusion and discomfort. But he still didn't get up, still didn't cross the room, not even now. Marcello must have followed my gaze. "He doesn't seem sure what to do." "That makes two of us," I admitted. "Only I'm not pretending otherwise." He looked down for a moment, then back at me. "Is he a good man?" I hesitated. A question I should have been able to answer quickly, but couldn't. "He can be," I said, "but when it matters, he chooses peace over me." Marcello didn't judge. He just nodded, as though he'd heard this kind of story before. Maybe he had. I imagined how many women had sat here over the years, unraveling stories in between bites of pasta and sips of wine. I wasn't the first to be let down by love disguised as neutrality. "Choosing peace is easy," Marcello said. "Choosing someone, really choosing them, that's the hard part." I looked at him, letting the words settle. They felt heavier than they should have, because deep down I knew he was right. My husband hadn't chosen me tonight. He hadn't defended me, hadn't protected me from humiliation. He'd watched it happen and stayed seated. I wondered if he was counting on me to forget it by morning, if he assumed I'd rationalize his silence the way I always did. But I couldn't shake what Marcello said. "You know what's strange?" I asked. "What?" "I spent years trying to make them like me. Thinking that if I just got it right, if I dressed right, spoke right, stayed out of the way, they'd eventually accept me. And did they?" I shook my head. They accepted my absence. That was enough for them. Marcello leaned in slightly. Maybe tonight wasn't a rejection. Maybe it was a release. That caught me off guard. I hadn't thought of it that way. But the idea planted itself quickly, and it grew. A release. From pretending, from performing, from hoping for scraps. Across the room, the table was quiet now. Maybe dessert had been served. Maybe the tension had spread. Or maybe they were still trying to figure out what they were seeing, me smiling, me laughing, me not begging. For the first time, I felt something unexpected. Gratitude. Not for their cruelty, but for the clarity it had forced on me, and for the stranger who had shown me, without knowing me, that I deserved better. The check never came. At some point between the last spoonful of the tart and my second refill of champagne, I realized Marcello had discreetly handled it. I started to protest, but he waved it off with an easy smile. "Consider it a thank you," he said. "For what?" "For choosing yourself. It's rarer than you think." There was something about the way he said it, soft but certain, that made me pause. I nodded, accepting the gesture. Gratitude didn't need to be loud. It could live in a quiet exchange between two people who understood the value of moments like this. As the plates were cleared and the room began to thin out, he asked, "Would you like a quick look behind the scenes?" I blinked. "Like the kitchen?" His grin widened. "More than that. The whole story." Something in me hesitated, an old reflex that checked every decision through the lens of politeness, of how it would look. But that voice had grown quieter over the course of the evening. Tonight wasn't about how it looked. It was about how it felt. "All right," I said. "Let's see the story." He stood and extended a hand, not dramatically, just respectfully. I took it without overthinking, and he guided me gently away from the dining area. The hallway behind the main room was narrow, painted in warm tones with framed photographs of the restaurant's evolution. Marcello walked slowly, telling small stories with each step. There was the photo of him in his 20s, flour on his cheek, beaming beside a dough mixer. Another one showed his grandmother's handwritten recipe card, preserved behind glass. "She taught me how to cook," he said, "but more importantly, she taught me how to feed people." The difference is subtle but vital. I followed him into the kitchen next. It was quieter than I expected, with a few lingering chefs cleaning, joking softly. He greeted each by name, introduced me without explanation, and everyone returned to their work without missing a beat. "I don't shout back here," he said. "Respect tastes better when it's mutual." We exited into a smaller corridor and reached a narrow staircase. At the top, a heavy door led us to the rooftop. The night air hit me gently, cool, clean, and scented faintly with herbs. Potted rosemary, thyme, and lavender filled the space. Tiny lights strung along the railing cast a warm glow over everything. Marcello stood at the edge, looking out over the city. I joined him quietly. "This is my favorite part," he said. "Even when the place is full up here, it's just peace." I inhaled deeply. "It's beautiful." He nodded. "I used to come here when things were falling apart downstairs, when we had no customers, when the oven broke, when I thought maybe I'd made a mistake leaving everything behind." "You really built all this from nothing?" He turned toward me. "Not nothing. I had failure and desperation and shame. You'd be surprised how far those three can take you when you stop being afraid of them." That struck a nerve. I looked out at the skyline, trying to swallow the knot in my throat. "I think I've been afraid for a long time, of being seen as a burden, of being too much, not enough, wrong for the people I wanted to be right for." He didn't interrupt, just listened. It was strange how easy it became to say those things with him. Maybe because there was no weight of expectation, no history to clean up, just a clean slate. I kept telling myself if I stayed quiet, patient, kind enough, they'd see me, they'd welcome me. But tonight proved they were never waiting to let me in. Marcello exhaled slowly. "Sometimes the invitation you think you're waiting for is never coming. And that's not your failure, that's their limit." We stood in silence for a long moment. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't flirtatious. It was something more grounded. Two people connected not by circumstance but by recognition. He glanced toward the door. "Want to see the wine cellar?" I smiled. "You mean there's more?" "There's always more," he said, eyes twinkling. We descended into a dim, cool basement lined with oak racks and soft lighting. Bottles in perfect rows, organized by region, vintage, and rarity. He walked between them like a curator in a gallery. "This," he said, "is my memory vault. Every label is a chapter." He pulled one from the shelf and held it up. "This bottle, first wedding I catered. Bride wept through the vows. Still the best duck I've ever made." Another one. "This one? I drank it the day we finally broke even. Took one sip, cried like a child." He placed them back with care. I watched him, realizing how deeply this place was woven into who he was. Not a business, but a body. A breathing, evolving thing he'd nourished with years of risk and resilience. "You turned pain into something people line up for," I said. Marcello looked at me, something quiet flickering behind his eyes. "So will you," he said. We stepped out of the cellar slowly, the quiet hum of the restaurant wrapping around us again. The night had deepened. Most of the diners had left, leaving behind the clatter of silverware being cleared and the gentle murmur of closing rituals. I felt the shift instantly, back to reality, back to the room where it all started. My steps were lighter, but my heart beat with a strange rhythm. Not panic, not dread. Something more complicated, like walking into a dream you'd already decided to leave behind. Marcello paused beside me, nodding slightly toward the dining room. "Your table's wrapping up." I followed his gaze. My in-laws were gathering their things, coats draped over arms, handbags snapped shut. Their expressions weren't celebratory. They looked unsettled. Even my mother-in-law, who never allowed herself to appear less than composed, wore a tight-lipped look that bordered on unease. And my husband, he stood apart from them slightly, his eyes locked on mine the moment I entered the room. Marcello glanced at me. "You ready?" "Not really," I said, then added, "but that hasn't stopped me tonight." He smiled, the kind that doesn't press, and gently took my hand for a brief second. "Whatever happens next, don't forget this part. You chose it." "I won't," I whispered. Then he released me, stepped back into the quiet rhythm of his restaurant and vanished around the corner. Just like that. No drama. No lingering looks. Just a graceful departure from a chapter that had changed me. I walked toward the entrance, back straight, heart steady. My husband met me halfway. His expression was guarded, a little flushed, like someone caught between embarrassment and frustration. "What are you doing?" he asked, voice low but tense. "I had dinner," I said. "What did you think I was doing?" "With the owner." "With someone who saw me," I said. "Someone who made space when yours didn't." He shifted his weight, glancing over his shoulder to where his mother stood, now watching us without even pretending to look away. "You made a scene." "No," I said quietly. "You all did. I just refused to disappear into it." His jaw clenched. "You could have just said something." I raised my eyebrows. "You mean when we arrived and there wasn't a chair for me? Or when your mother handed me off to a bar stool like a forgotten coat? Or when you sat down and let it all happen?" He didn't respond. I stepped closer, keeping my voice even. "You didn't forget me, and neither did they. You just didn't think it mattered enough to fix." That's the part I can't ignore anymore. Still, he said nothing. And maybe that silence again was the real answer. Not anger, not defense. Just nothing. The absence of action, of apology, of acknowledgement. Behind us, the family murmured nervously, shuffling out the door with clipped goodbyes. My husband looked like he wanted to say something more, but the words didn't come. Marcello had said something earlier that now echoed louder than ever. Choosing someone is the hard part. He hadn't chosen me, not when it counted. As the group filtered out, I turned toward the front door. Marcello reappeared just long enough to catch my eye. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just a single nod, like a book closing. I returned the nod and stepped outside. The air was cooler now, the city quieter. I wrapped my arms around myself, not from cold, but from the sudden quiet after a night that had stirred everything inside me. My husband walked beside me to the car, still not speaking, still assuming this was something we could unpack behind closed doors, but I wasn't sure anymore. The door he thought I'd walk through like always. It might have closed behind me when I'd stood at that table and asked for one seat, just for me. We rode in silence, headlights slicing through the dark. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just watched the streets pass by, knowing this wasn't over, but also knowing something irreversible had happened. He'd let them erase me. And I had let him. But tonight, I'd also done something else. I had stopped asking to be seen, and I had seen myself instead. The car was too quiet. No music, no conversation, just the low hum of the engine and the occasional turn signal clicking like a slow metronome. I stared out the passenger window, watching streetlights stretch across the glass, blinking past in steady rhythm. Each one marked another moment of silence, another layer of something thick and unspoken between us. He gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly. I could see the tension in his knuckles, the stiffness in his shoulders. He was uncomfortable, clearly. But still he said nothing. I didn't rush to fill the silence. For years I had. with small talk, with apologies, with deflections. I'd smoothed over every sharp edge in our relationship to keep the peace, but peace built on erasure isn't peace at all. It's surrender. So I let the silence breathe, let it stretch, let it say what we didn't want to. Finally, maybe 5 blocks from home, he spoke. I didn't know what to do back there. His voice was low, cautious, as if admitting something fragile. I didn't look at him. You could have done anything, you chose nothing. That's not fair. I turned my head slowly. Isn't it? He sighed, one hand loosening from the wheel. It all happened so fast. I didn't want to escalate things. I gave a bitter laugh. Escalate? They left me standing in the middle of a restaurant without a chair, without an explanation, and your concern was escalation. He glanced at me, then back at the road. I didn't want to make a scene. And I didn't want to be humiliated, I said evenly. But here we are. His jaw clenched. I saw it in his profile, how he tried to keep his expression neutral, but it cracked just slightly. I thought maybe it was a mistake, that someone forgot to count. They didn't forget, I interrupted. They excluded me, on purpose. And you watched it happen. The silence that followed was heavier than the first. I turned back to the window. The lights blurred a little, not from tears, but from the strain of holding them back. Why didn't you come over? I asked softly. When you saw me sitting alone, why didn't you come to me? He didn't answer right away, just kept driving. When he finally spoke, it was quieter than before. I didn't know if you wanted me to. I laughed again, but there was no humor in it. You didn't know if I wanted you to? I wanted you to fight for me, or at the very least sit beside me. Something. He sighed, frustrated. You didn't ask me to. And there it is, I said. That's the problem. I always have to ask. The truth landed hard between us. I was tired of asking. For space, for respect, for acknowledgement, for basic human decency from the people who claimed to be my family, and from the man I married. You know what hurts the most? I asked. Not that they excluded me. I expected that, on some level. What hurts is that you let them. He didn't respond. Maybe because there was no defense, maybe because he finally heard it the way I needed him to. The rest of the ride was wordless, street after street, memory after memory, now laced with a new, unbearable clarity. Every time I'd swallowed my feelings, every time I'd told myself it wasn't a big deal, every time I'd let him off the hook for choosing quiet over confrontation. At a red light, he finally said, I didn't think it would matter this much. I looked at him, really looked, and saw the root of it. He didn't understand. Not fully. Not yet. It always mattered, I said. You just never noticed because I never made you. We pulled into the driveway. The porch light was on. The house looked the same as always, but something inside me had shifted too far to return to what was familiar. We sat there, engine off, keys still in the ignition. Neither of us moved. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted. I nodded slowly. I don't know if it's mine to fix anymore. His head dropped slightly, like he'd been bracing for those words. I reached for the door handle, pausing just long enough to say one last thing. You don't have to fight every battle, but when the fight is for me and you walk away, what are we even doing? I stepped out before he could respond. Inside, the air was still. I stood in the quiet of our home, realizing I wasn't sure what I was holding on to anymore. Marriage wasn't supposed to feel like this, like being tolerated, like being silent so someone else could remain comfortable. Something had cracked open tonight, and I wasn't sure I wanted to seal it shut again. The next morning arrived with a strange stillness, the kind of quiet that doesn't soothe but unsettles. I lay in bed longer than usual, the events of the night pressing against my chest like the weight of something unfinished. He had already left the bedroom. I could hear the distant clink of dishes in the kitchen, either a peace offering or a distraction, maybe both. I rolled over, reached for my phone without thinking, and was surprised to find a message waiting. From an unknown number. Hope you're still smiling this morning. M. I stared at it for a long time, not because of the sender, Marcello, but because of the simplicity of the words. Hope you're still smiling. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a demand for explanation. It was just care. Small. Uncomplicated. I typed out a response, then deleted it. Typed again. Deleted again. Eventually, I just saved the number. I didn't need to respond. Not yet. A few hours later, another message came through. Wine tasting next Thursday. Private event. Thought of you. No pressure. No pressure. 2 words I hadn't felt in so long. They read like poetry. In the kitchen, my husband made eggs. He didn't look up when I walked in, just asked if I wanted some, as though nothing had happened. As though last night hadn't cracked something between us wide open. I said no, poured myself a coffee and sat at the far end of the table. He cleared his throat. I thought maybe we could talk later, about yesterday. I nodded. Maybe. But I didn't mean maybe. I meant not now. There was a time when that wouldn't have been enough to hold him back, when he would have pushed, demanded. Tried to control the narrative, but not today. Today he looked tired too. Later I opened my closet and stared at my clothes. Everything looked like a version of the woman I had tried to be for them, for their comfort, for his convenience. Safe colors, soft edges. Nothing that challenged, nothing that made a statement. I pulled out the deep red blouse I hadn't worn in months. Not since he'd said it was a bit much for a family brunch. I put it on, looked in the mirror, didn't take it off. That afternoon, I RSVP'd to Marcello's wine tasting, not with words, just with the automated yes from the invitation. And it wasn't about Marcello, not in the way anyone might assume. This wasn't a romance blooming. It wasn't some dramatic escape into the arms of another man. It was about me, about choosing something, about saying yes to something that made me feel more like myself, about showing up for a version of me that had been buried beneath compromise and silence. He didn't ask for a reason, and that was what made it feel right. Later that night, as I sat on the back porch, sipping from a glass of white wine that was probably too sweet, my husband joined me. He sat beside me, not close, not far, just there. "You're quiet," he said. I nodded. He rubbed his hands together, stared out at the yard. "I've been thinking about what you said." I waited. I never realized how much you were holding back, how much space I wasn't making for you. There it was, the thing I'd wanted to hear. And yet, it didn't land the way I thought it would. Maybe because words once delayed too long lose their weight. I didn't just need space, I said. I needed partnership, presence, someone who saw what was happening and stood next to me, not behind me, not across the room. He nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." "I know." And I believed he meant it, but I also knew that apology was just the beginning of something, not the end. And I wasn't sure if I had the energy to build from that starting point anymore. He asked, "Where do we go from here?" I looked at the sky, pale lavender now, the last stretch of day fading into night. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I know where I'm going Thursday." He turned to me puzzled. "Wine tasting," I said. "Marcello invited me." His eyes narrowed, not angry, just confused. "Why?" "Because he saw something in me," I said, "and because I want to go." He didn't argue. He didn't say no, and I didn't ask for permission. That was the change. It wasn't about rebellion or resentment. It was about choice. My choice. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had one. Months passed, seasons shifted, and so did I. There wasn't one single moment that marked the change. No fireworks, no dramatic exits, just a quiet accumulation of decisions that piece by piece rebuilt me from the inside out. I moved through the days differently now, lighter somehow. Not because everything was perfect, but because I'd stopped trying to shrink myself into a version of womanhood that fit someone else's script. And then one evening, I found myself back at La Vieille table. I hadn't planned it. A friend of a friend was celebrating a milestone, and the invitation came through casually. I almost said no. But something inside me, curious, steady, said yes. When I walked through those doors again, it felt like a return, not a retreat. The chandeliers still shimmered. The tables were still draped in linen and candlelight. But everything felt different because I was different. Marcello spotted me from across the room and gave a small wave from the kitchen. No grand gesture, just a warm flicker of acknowledgement, the kind you give someone who stood at a crossroads and kept walking. I wasn't alone this time. I was with people who saw me, friends I'd gathered intentionally over the past few months. People who didn't ask me to soften or bend. People who welcomed the version of me that didn't apologize for taking up space. We ordered the duck, the oysters, the same champagne from that unforgettable night. Every bite felt like a quiet celebration of growth, of resilience, of remembering who I was before I tried to be who they needed. Someone at the table asked about my marriage. I told them the truth. "We're still figuring things out," I said, "but this time I'm not the only one doing the work." And that was enough for now. Growth didn't require a clean break. Sometimes it just needed a new foundation. I looked around the table at the laughter, the ease, the warmth, and realized this too was family. Not the kind built from obligation, but from intention. Marcello passed by once more before disappearing for the night. He caught my eye and offered a small nod. I nodded back. No words were needed. He had given me more than a seat at a table that night. He'd reminded me that I could make my own, that I didn't have to wait for a space to be offered, I could claim it. And I had. As we toasted again, I thought about how far I'd come. About the silence that once choked me. About the fear that kept me seated at the edge of other people's comfort. And how now I was sitting in the center of my own story. To anyone who's ever felt excluded, overlooked, or asked to dim themselves, this story is for you. You are not too much. You are not too loud, too sensitive, too difficult. You are just enough, exactly as you are. And if this story made you feel seen even for a moment, hit that subscribe button. Because there's more where this came from. More stories of quiet revolutions, of women who said, enough, of lives rebuilt not in defiance, but in truth. And if you're ready for another powerful journey, click the video on your screen now. It's a story about another woman who turned humiliation into freedom and found her voice along the way. Because you deserve to hear stories that remind you you're not alone, and you never were.